When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube, and welcome back to the Grease Commons YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about abandoned plot lines. Now, this is going to be the first episode. Depending on how you guys like this first episode, we might do more of these, make it a series. I was initially going to do a video just talking about all of the dropped plot lines that we've seen throughout the books, but this is a big one. So the 5-year gap is what we're going to be talking about in today's video. And again, let me know down in the comments if you want to see me continue to do abandoned plot lines or drop your own that you might have. But this one's going to be focused on the 5-year gap that was supposed to be happening after A Storm of Swords into A Feast and Dance with Dragons. So if you do not know, there was basically supposed to be a 5-year gap between those books. Now, it makes a lot of sense because if you look at where characters end in A Storm of Swords and where they pick up in the other two books, it makes a lot of sense that the groundwork was kind of laid there for George to do, but for one reason or another, he decided to go against it. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to subscribe, like, and comment, please do help the channel grow, reach our people that might like this content as well. And let's get back into the video. So, the 5-year gap. Let's take a look where a lot of our characters were and if it possibly would have made sense to actually keep the 5-year gap. So let's look at Jon. Jon is a character that at the end of A Storm of Swords is the Lord Commander. And I think it makes a lot of sense for Jon to have been ruling for 5 years there or whatever, and then come back and see kind of the decisions he's made in those 5 years. And you can still do a lot of the similar beats that happen in A Dance with Dragons, but just Jon is a lot more experienced, he's older, it makes a bit more sense. Let's look at some of our other main characters. Daenerys, she starts ruling in Meereen. So Meereen, again, you can have another 5-year period where she's ruling, we can kind of reflect, see what she's done in those 5 years, and still hit the same plot beats as A Dance with Dragons. So again, what we're going to see through this 5-year gap that George had initially planned is that a lot of the characters in The Storm of Swords are placed in positions where it makes sense that you would let them age up and get more experience, so that when you came back with those characters, it makes a lot of sense where they pick up these skills, and it just allows the story to maybe go in a different direction. So another character, we'll talk about Arya. Arya goes to train with the Faceless Men. It makes a lot of sense if we have a 5-year period where Arya is training with the Faceless Men. A lot of the skills we're going to see later on in the books with her Faceless Men training would have made a lot more sense. It's like, yeah, she's been here for 5 years. It's kind of the Star Wars effect, right? Where you have the prequels where it's like you have all these Jedi who train their entire lives to become good Jedi. But then in the originals, we see that Luke is maybe trained for a little bit, right? You know, it doesn't seem like a lot of time goes by in his training. That's kind of how it is with Arya, where the initial plan was Arya was going to train for 5 years, and then we would come back into her, you know, a couple years later, and we'd still see her developing her skills and stuff like that. So it would be almost like 6 years, right, before she would, I guess, leave. And I think that specifically, that character specifically makes a ton of sense for why we would have a 5-year gap. Now, characters it doesn't make as much sense on are characters like Tyrion. I think seeing Tyrion's raw reaction and his brain and what he's going through right after A Storm of Swords with killing his father and all this stuff and being kind of transported over to Essos and Pentos, I think seeing him right away is much better than seeing him 5 years. Because if we come back into his story 5 years after the events of Storm of Swords, and he's still this bitter character, he's still this kind of the character he is now, I think you look at his character and like, wow, he's been like this for 5 years. He's been with Illyrio for 5 years. Like, some characters, I don't think it makes as much sense as it does with other ones. So another character we can talk about that made a ton of sense, Sansa. Seeing Sansa with Littlefinger for 5 years, where she learns all these skills to become a player of the game, and letting her age up a little. So her marriages and all that stuff seem a bit more believable. I think she's 14 in the books. in Dance, or not Dance, Feast. So I think she's 14. If you aged her up, she'd be like 19. Makes a bit more sense. She'd be aged up. You could do a lot more with her character. So again, that character makes a lot of sense as to why she would be that way, right? And where she would have these skills that we have to see. Because the problem with A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons is a lot of those books have to show us these characters developing their skills and all of that. Because we don't have that 5-year gap, right? Because the 5-year gap in and of itself would have created enough to where you can say, yes, these characters have been training, and you can even dedicate one chapter to showing us, especially like how Arya, right? Arya only has 5 chapters in the 2 books, Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, where you can show us one chapter where she's kind of learning or having a lesson, and then you can progress with a lot more of her plot like we see in those books. So again, it makes a bit more sense how she's getting these skills so quickly. I think George still does a very good job in the normal story, but I think a 5-year gap heavily benefits our younger characters. Characters like Tyrion, not so much. If we look at characters like a Cersei, possibly, I think Cersei is another good one where does Cersei's plot work better if Tommen's older? Because the thing is, if Tommen's a bit older, right, and I think he's, 10, 11, during... I'm not sure on ages, by the way. I'm just trying to remember. I'm not good with ages in the books, but I think he's like 10 or 11 coming onto the throne. If we age it up and he's like 15, 16, does his plot still work? Because Tommen is very much a kid. He's even more of a kid than in the show version. He very much is susceptible to being manipulated heavily. Would that still have worked and been as believable in the show with a lot of other characters trying to manipulate Tommen? Would that have worked as well? I don't know. I think characters like Cersei and Jaime are affected probably negatively from that. And I think that's the reason George probably didn't do the 5-year gap, because I think it affects certain plots better than it affects others. Having Tommen sit on the throne for 5 years while, characters like Stannis for 5 years is just gonna have to be around in the north, just kind of fucking around. And then it doesn't particularly fit Stannis's character, and that's what I'm saying is in certain plots don't make as much sense, or we have a little bit more questions when we talk about the older characters of the books. Now, the younger characters, it definitely does wonders. Like Rickon is a character that we haven't seen him in a while, but instead of him being very young, he would be a bit older. He would be around Tommen's age when Davos goes on this mission. So those elements of the story feel like they were set up for the 5-year gap, but it didn't happen. So we're now faced with elements of the story still feel like these characters should be aged up and the story would work a lot better. But because we didn't do that age gap, characters like Rickon aren't going to make as much sense. Where Rickon's going to be more of a kid. He's not, again, he's still very young. He's not really going to be in a position to kind of rule or even be like it's tough because it's like he's not even at Tommen age, right? Where Tommen is someone who's still very childlike. He's not ready for the throne. Rickon's even less than that, right? Rickon is even younger. So that's kind of what you look at, because you look at Tommen and Bran, they were around the same age. Again, it also makes sense with Bran. Bran would have a lot of time to train north of the wall and all of that stuff. So even that part of the story makes a lot more sense as well. So we don't have to spend as much time with Bran learning these skills. We can kind of just be told in this 5-year period, he learned his skills and how he kind of did better with these skills and what he kind of went through a bit. And instead of having to actively make that. And it helps the story progress quicker, which is something I think would have helped George a lot when it comes to writing Winds of Winter. But I'm not sure. So that is something I wanted to talk about in today's video. I could talk about this topic for quite a bit just because you can go through almost every story or storyline in the books and you can kind of decipher and look at them and go, okay, does this make sense? Right? Because Quentin, another character, he would be a little bit older, right? So it would make sense. Quentin going off by himself, trying to get Daenerys. He's not as young. Makes a bit more sense. You just have situations like that. Now where you would run into problems again. the Greyjoys, right? We hear in A Storm of Swords that Balon is dead. So you couldn't have a 5-year gap where we just don't get to see anything that happens in the Iron Islands, because again, that would have already happened. So us re-entering the story would have been like, okay, so Euron took over. How did he do that? Like, there are certain plots that, because of how they're set up in A Storm of Swords, the 5-year gap really hurts their plots. Like, the Iron Islands is a big one, right? The Iron Islands is a really big one. I think Dorne is another big one, because we'd be coming 5 years after Oberyn's death. And you're just now kind of having these simmers. Like, the problem is with the 5-year gap, it eliminates a lot of really cool storylines, like the Iron Islands, like Dorne. So there's a lot of things like that the 5-year gap helps and it hurts. So let me know what you guys think about some of the plots that talk about that the 5-year gap negatively affects, and how maybe George could have changed those. So thank you guys all for watching. Let me know again in the comments what you guys think about the 5-year gap. Should George have done it? Should he not have done it? And what do you guys think? So I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.